December 17, 1944. The Ardennes lay silent beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Birch and pine trees sagged under the weight, their branches like weary sentinels bowing to winter's relentless grip. The air was sharp and brittle, carrying a cold so pure it seemed to hum. On a ridge overlooking the narrow road between Houffalize and Bastogne, a single M2 Browning heavy machine gun rested in a shallow dugout, its dark barrel cutting through the pale landscape like a shadow against light. Somewhere beyond the tree line came the groan of steel. Private First Class Daniel Hartman, 23 years old, lay behind the weapon. No medals, no commendations. Just another gunner in U.S. 28th Infantry Division assigned to what his officers called a quiet sector. The night before, they'd said the line here was stable, but the front was shifting, like ice cracking beneath boots. And now, the distant grinding grew clearer. Metal treads on frozen ground, diesel engines coughing in the cold. Then he heard them. Panthers. Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther engines. Deep, throaty, unmistakable. Not one. Many. Hartman peered through the iron sights. Down in the valley, through thin wisps of fog, a column of German armor slithered forward between the trees. He counted 1 tank, then 3, then 8. They moved like predators, engines rumbling in unison, steel beasts advancing toward Bastogne before American defenses could harden. The air itself seemed to stop breathing. His orders were clear: observe, report, don't engage. But orders and survival rarely spoke the same language. The wind carried faint German voices, the metallic rattle of track skirts brushing frozen branches. The lead tank rolled over the narrow road, breaking through the frost with each turn of its treads. Hartman's finger hovered near the trigger guard. Snowflakes gathered on his gloves. 8 tanks, no support on his ridge, just him, the machine gun, and the forest. Then he made the decision. The first tracer round sliced through the darkness like a match struck in a tomb. It struck the vision slit of the lead Panther, sending sparks showering off the steel. It wasn't a kill shot. It wasn't meant to be. It was a message. The convoy shuddered to a halt. Gears ground. The Panther treads slipped as the lead vehicle tried to pivot on the icy road, its movement jerky, unnatural. The column bunched up behind it like a steel serpent knotting itself in panic. In the stillness of the ridge, Hartman reloaded. Snow absorbed the sound of his Defiance. 8 tanks had been stopped by a single burst. 1 man, 1 gun, and a frozen forest had just stalled a spearhead. Below, the engines growled with frustration. Above, the trees whispered in the wind. And somewhere in that tension, the night held its breath. But the night wasn't done with them yet. That breath, the one caught in the turret, finally released when the first shell came. The lead Panther spat fire into the tree line and the ridge erupted in splinters. A tree beside Hartman exploded into jagged shards, its trunk shattering like glass. Snow cascaded from the canopy, covering the dugout in a white veil as the shockwave rippled through the earth. Hartman ducked low, pressing himself against the frozen dirt, his pulse thundering in his ears. His hands moved without thought. He swung the heavy gun back into position, fingers feeding the ammunition belt with mechanical precision. The steel shield before him trembled as the M2 settled into its new angle. Through the smoke, the column below shifted. A half-track crept forward, its headlights dimmed to a combat blackout glow. German infantry leapt off its sides like wolves released from the leash, their silhouettes fanning out into the trees, weapons drawn and searching. They didn't know where the gunfire had come from. That gave him seconds. Seconds were a luxury on the Ardennes front. Hartman adjusted his aim, not on the tank itself as he'd been trained, but at the narrow road beneath it. He began raking the ice with controlled bursts. Tracers sparked off the frozen surface, ricocheting unpredictably. It wasn't about hitting anything vital. It was about buying time, confusing the column, making them feel like they were surrounded. The effect was immediate. The second and third Panthers tried to reposition. The road, slick with frost, betrayed them. Treads slipped, gears shrieked. The column's perfect formation began to fracture. 8 tanks in the middle of a snow-choked road were suddenly fighting the ground as much as the enemy. Deep behind the lines, in a listening post 2 miles away, a sergeant jolted upright at the sharp, steady rhythm of Hartman's unauthorized firing. He spat out his coffee, grabbed the radio, and barked orders. Reinforcements began to move, though everyone knew they wouldn't get there in time. Down below, the Germans fired green flares into the sky. The forest answered with a thud, then another. Mortars. Snow and earth exploded around Hartman like geysers. Chunks of wood and ice rained down. His dugout shook, the wooden braces groaning like bones. But he didn't let go of the trigger. He wasn't following doctrine anymore. He was holding ground by instinct, not regulation. The machine gun bucked and roared in his hands, its barrel glowing faintly in the cold. With each burst, he denied the enemy their momentum. For every second he held them here, Bastogne had a breath more to live. Then he saw movement through the drifting smoke. A Panther slipping sideways on the shattered road. Its gun swiveled, searching for him. At the same moment, a German infantry squad broke cover, spreading like ink on snow, moving to flank his position. Hartman tracked them through the sights, the barrel steady, his breathing slow and cold. Click. Thump. Fire. The night lit up again, and history edged closer to a fault line. The flash illuminated faces. For a heartbeat, it was as if the forest itself had frozen in that burst of light. German helmets gleamed like polished stone, stark against the snow, their shadows cutting through the drifting smoke. A squad of infantry was caught mid-charge, eyes wide, rifles raised, every man suspended in a moment too brief to matter. Then the burst ripped through them. Snowbanks exploded, bodies crumpled. The survivors dove for cover, returning fire into the ridge with desperate, blind bursts. Hartman's hands never stopped. The ammunition belt hissed and rattled like a living thing, feeding the M2's glowing throat. His mind no longer processed each shot. It created a rhythm, a strange, deliberate pattern. Long, high, left, short, low, right. Pause. Repeat. It was nothing he'd been taught, nothing in any manual. It was instinct, part hunter, part survival. The result was chaos. The erratic bursts ricocheted through the valley, forcing the German crews to misread his position. The Panther gunners believed they were taking fire from multiple nests on the ridge. They pivoted turrets in different directions, searching for enemies that didn't exist. One gunner fired into empty woods. Another sprayed the tree line too high. 8 tanks, engineered for precision and dominance, were suddenly fighting ghosts. Below, the lead Panther tried to break free. Its treads bit into the ice, spinning furiously. The second tank pushed forward to help, but slipped into the ditch with a groan of steel on rock. The third reversed too late, colliding with the fourth. The perfect geometry of a Panzer spearhead shattered in seconds. What was once a disciplined advance became a steel traffic jam in the frozen dark. 2 miles away, artillery crews were on the move. They didn't know who was holding the column. They didn't know it was one man, one gun, a broken ridge. They only knew something had stalled the German armor. That alone was enough. Up on the hill, Hartman's world narrowed to sound and recoil. The M2's barrel smoked, heat shimmering into the cold air. The air smelled of burnt oil, cordite, and snow melting on hot metal. His shoulder throbbed from the recoil, skin raw under the fabric of his jacket. His ear rang from the mortar shock. But he didn't stop. Then the ridge screamed. A mortar shell fell close, too close. The dugout detonated upward in a violent spray of earth and timber. Hartman flew backward, ribs cracking against frozen ground. His helmet slid off, his breath gone, his world blurred. The tripod had cracked. The barrel had bent slightly. But the gun was still there, blackened, steaming, alive. He dragged himself toward it on hands and knees, coughing blood into the snow. Around him, the trench was gone. The ridge was splintered. The forest burned in patches like a wounded beast. And still he mounted the gun. The valley below was chaos. Tanks trapped in ice, men shouting in German, flares cutting the sky. But their next move would not be blind. They were learning. They were hunting back. The barrel of a Panther steadied, its long cannon glinting beneath the flares. For one long, silent second, history balanced on that line of sight. And then the world held its breath. That breath, the one frozen in the turret, shattered when the first high-explosive shell slammed into the ridge. The world erupted in light. A shockwave punched through the trees, flattening what little remained of Hartman's dugout. The ground shook like something alive beneath the snow, and the concussion hurled him flat against the earth. For a moment there was no sound, just ringing. A white, soundless void, broken only by the distant growl of engines. When the world bled back into focus, he tasted iron. Snow clung to his face, streaked with blood from a shallow cut across his temple. The M2 lay on its side, blackened, half buried in churned snow. Below, the German column had begun to reorganize. Panthers shifted their weight, engines howling as crews shouted in sharp, clipped German. The chaos he had created was starting to knit itself back together. They were adapting. Flares burst overhead, painting the forest in an unholy green glow. It looked like a cathedral of smoke and frost, its arches built from shattered trees. One Panther pulled to the right, its tread clawing at the frozen ground. Another inched forward, turret tracking the ridge with slow, methodical menace. Hartman dragged the gun back to its mount, coughing into the snow. His gloves were soaked, his breath ragged. He could feel the ground vibrating with each tank's movement, the kind of slow, deliberate push that said the Germans believed they'd found their prey. A squad of infantry advanced along the ditch, tight formation, disciplined. No more charging blindly. They had him. Or at least they thought they did. Through the green flare light, Hartman studied their advance. The tanks had locked into a classic leapfrogging pattern. One firing, one advancing, one covering. It was a methodical kill box, the kind designed to crush machine gun nests like his into silence. But the forest still had its tricks. A fallen pine trunk, heavy with ice, had been partially blasted loose by the mortars. It now hung at an angle over the road, its root system cracked but clinging. Directly below it, a Panther was slowly inching forward. Hartman's eyes narrowed. He shifted the M2, not at the tank, but at the trunk's weakened base. The barrel hissed in the cold as he lined up the shot. One burst. Two. The wood splintered under the heat. The massive trunk groaned, then snapped. The tree fell like a guillotine. It crashed across the road, slamming into the Panther's hull with a deafening crunch. Its crew panicked, the tank jerking to a stop as branches and ice showered the valley. The entire column froze again. Hartman seized the opening, raking the infantry line below with another rapid-fire pattern, sparks kicking up from the snow like fireflies. German flares popped brighter. Their formation fractured a second time. Every second he bought was another heartbeat for Bastogne. Every round he fired made the forest feel larger than it was. One gunner had turned a ridge into a front line. But the Germans were not retreating. Not this time. Two Panthers swung their guns in unison, barrel lights catching the snow like spears of steel. Their cannons steadied, slow and deliberate, aimed at the ridge itself. The air went still. Even the wind stopped moving. And then, from far behind, faint but clear, came a sound Hartman had prayed for. The distant whine of American engines, half-tracks and jeeps pushing hard through the forest. Reinforcements. The Panthers didn't know yet. But he did. The next minute would decide whether they lived to arrive or came for a body. The tanks fired in unison. The first shell hit high, tearing through the canopy and raining embers over the ridge. The second struck closer, obliterating what remained of the foxhole. Snow, soil, and splinters cascaded into the air in a roar that drowned everything. Hartman was thrown backward again, this time landing hard, his ribs screaming, his vision strobing between light and shadow. The M2 toppled beside him, its barrel cracked, its frame still smoking. For the first time since the fight began, he hesitated. Down below, the German column was moving again. 2 Panthers pushed forward, cautiously this time, their guns sweeping from side to side. Infantry advanced behind them, disciplined, relentless. Their breath fogged in the cold air, rifles steady. The forest glowed under flare light. A battlefield turned into a frozen cathedral of smoke and fire. Hartman crawled toward the M2, his gloves torn, his breath ragged. The weapon was nearly destroyed. Its barrel warped, the tripod twisted. It could still fire, but only once before seizing. He knew it. He also knew the road below was still narrow, still frozen, still treacherous. He looked down the slope at the approaching tanks. In the distance, he could see movement behind them. Faint muzzle flashes, but not German. Reinforcements. American armor and infantry were threading through the far tree line. They were close, but not close enough. If the Germans broke through here, that column would be crushed before it even reached the ridge. Hartman dug his elbow into the snow and braced the M2 against a fallen log. He fed the last belt of ammunition into the weapon, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. The gun was bent, but it would fire once more. He set his sights not on the tanks, but on the ground between them. He waited. The first Panther crossed the frozen bend, its weight pressing deep into the ice. The second followed. Hartman exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The M2 screamed one last time. The burst tore into the snow just ahead of the lead tank, punching holes into the ice. The Panther lurched forward another foot, and the ground gave way. The frozen crust cracked like glass under a hammer. The tank's front end dipped, then sank. Its treads spun violently, flinging slush into the air. The second Panther tried to reverse, its gunner shouting orders, but the weight of the first pulled it sideways into the same pit. 2 tanks locked together, their own mass turning the road into a trap. Below, the German infantry froze in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Some shouted for engineers, others scrambled to flank. But the delay was fatal. From the western tree line, the sound came, a rising thunder of American artillery. The first shells screamed overhead and struck the valley like hammers from heaven. The ridge shook under the impact. The road below dissolved into fire and snow. Hartman covered his head as shrapnel rained down. He could feel the heat even through the cold. When the barrage finally eased, the valley was unrecognizable. A landscape of twisted steel and burning wreckage. Through the haze, a shape emerged. A Sherman tank, its star insignia faint beneath the grime, crawling up the opposite slope. Behind it, a platoon of American infantry advanced cautiously, weapons raised. Hartman tried to lift himself, but his strength was gone. The M2 lay silent beside him, its last round spent. He slumped against the frozen log, breath shallow, vision tunneling to a soft gray blur. Below, the American lieutenant raised his binoculars, scanning the ridge. He caught sight of the gun nest, of the broken weapon, the collapsed earth, and the single motionless figure lying beside it. He lowered the binoculars slowly. Whoever was up there, he murmured, held the line. By morning, the road was clear. The German column was gone, burned, buried, or retreating north through the woods. Bastogne had survived another day. They found Hartman's body still beside the gun, one hand resting on the receiver, the other frozen into the snow. No one ever confirmed his name in the official report. There was only a note in the margin of the battalion log. Enemy armor delayed. Single gun position, effective fire pattern, origin unknown. History forgot his orders, but it remembered his defiance. He had broken the rules, and in doing so, broken a Panzer column. The forest kept its silence. The snow fell again, but somewhere in the frozen heart of the Ardennes, the echo of that unauthorized burst still lived, a defiant rhythm against the march of steel. The smoke settled over the valley like a shroud. The battle was finished. What had begun as a whisper of engines in the dark had ended in a storm of fire and snow. The Panzer column lay scattered. Some burned where they stood, others half buried in the ice, frozen in retreat. The forest that had once been silent now reeked of cordite and diesel, its trees splintered, its stillness forever broken. On the ridge, the M2 Browning sat silent, its barrel blackened, its steel fused with frost. Next to it lay Hartmann, motionless, his body half covered by drifting snow. The dawn light found him there, the man who had turned defiance into defense, chaos into salvation. He hadn't lived to see what he'd accomplished, but the forest had. The men who arrived hours later would never forget the sight. One gun, one ridge, one impossible stand. By midday, American units had retaken the valley. Bastogne was safe for another day. The official report never mentioned his name, just an unknown gunner whose effective fire delayed enemy armor movement. To history, he was a footnote. But to those who marched past that ridge, he was something else. Proof that courage doesn't need witnesses. War remembers the grand battles, the generals, the victories marked on maps. But sometimes it's the quiet, unrecorded acts, the lone gunner who refuses to retreat, who pulls the trigger when every rule says not to, that shape the outcome of everything. As dusk fell, the snow began again, soft and endless. The forest reclaimed the ridge, covering the scars, silencing the echoes. Yet beneath that silence, the rhythm of one gun still lingered, the heartbeat of a man who defied orders and changed history.